sometimes wonder, because compassion has this warm, soft side, if it might be diminished across time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you look at the field of psychology and how what's happened to it over time, as more women have entered that field, it's in some ways become less valued. Like we've seen financially, the amount that people can charge and stuff like that go down. I mean, there's other factors at play, but when I link up compassion with women, I have this fear that it might be diminished in some way. I don't know if you spent time thinking about it, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that particular problem that we struggle with.
I think this is a fabulous question, and one that I think most compassion-focused therapists or individuals that are working in the science of compassion have been struggling with. You know, is this kind of stereotype of compassion, kind of, is it going to diminish? Kind of, is it going to take away from our goal of empowerment?
Yeah.
And I think if we can continue to emphasize the fierce compassion component, this kind of agentic component, and also I think bringing to light on a more societal level how we are devaluing kind of certain perhaps nurturing or caretaking professions, and looking at the message we're giving to individuals by not compensating them on the same level as we would perhaps more competitive endeavors. And so what's interesting now is that within the compassionate movement, there has been a big push in business, in leadership, in kind of those things, those more capitalist endeavors to take on a more compassionate approach, which at first looks like they wouldn't necessarily fit together. However, we do see that with kind of some of these approaches, a more compassionate approach and a more gender equal approach, actually it is good for business, turns out, that we can actually kind of see the benefits of this. And I think that having more research, more women who are doing compassionate work that are visible, that we're able to see actually what that looks like, and also reap some of the benefits. I think ultimately, kind of from that behaviorist place, how can we get people to see the reinforcing kind of nature, what is so good about some of this work, and why should we value it more? As well as why should we value kind of diverse kind of voices of women, kind of similarly.
Fantastic. One of the things that's been striking me, I mean, really appreciating what you're saying about this, and it seems like in some way we have to stay on top of this, right? Like we've got to really message it in some ways, which is, I suppose, part of what we have to do anyway, although it feels a tiny bit unfortunate in some ways that you have to find ways to message it that can be heard and digested. Another one of the things that I've just been thinking about in my own work is how some things like mindfulness and compassion are starting to become overly techniqueized, like they're a little thing that you whip out and do when you're, feeling distressed or something like that. Whereas I conceptualize it differently. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about, like, as it gets popular, as you've seen it happen across time, that it becomes overly techniqueized. It's just something I've been curious about. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this issue.
Oh, absolutely. I definitely share in your concern around it, and also kind of thinking about kind of where some of the roots of some of this training lie in terms of the culture, history, kind of systemic, and even religious roots when it comes to kind of Buddhist psychology, different form of religion, but still wanting to honor that. And so if we kind of mechanize it and rip it out of its context, in that sense, I've always had concern. Particularly when it comes to compassion, because compassion really is a motivation. I don't ever see it as like a set of behaviors or skills, that those follow from tapping into this motivation to this sensitivity to suffering and the desire to do something about it. So how do we continue to kind of feed that motivation that we can tap into, that we can kind of allow ourselves to help drive some of this? It can be kind of more of a constant there. And so when I'm working with trainees or when I'm doing supervision in CFT, it's a lot about learning just to embody it. Okay. To really start from really basic therapy listening skills as modeling, compassionate mind through listening, through being, through connecting, through empathetic bridging. about kind of that sensitivity and reflecting to the person you're working with. And then maybe you might want to bring in some of the training for the other person. And that's one piece. That's the training practices, but without the full context, right? And tapping into the motivation that I can bring into the room as a therapist or in any interpersonal situation, really. That process and motivation can always be with me. I never have to pull it out of a box. I just have to tap back into it. Sometimes just like slowing down the breath or creating the physiological conditions for that motivation to arrive. Or kind of cognitive conditions, kind of thinking about my values, how I feel about suffering. Or emotionally, empathetically bridging to experiences of compassion in myself, in my history, receiving it from others, giving it to others, and kind of tapping into those experiences in order to embody that motivation that is the compassionate mind.
Right. So when you imagine women being able to do it at that level, not just an overly techniqueized, I'm going to whip it out kind of deal, but more of like, I'm going to tap into this thing that I've been working on and practicing. I'm going to look at my thought, emotion, and physiological motivation, if I'm understanding you correctly. If you sort of imagine women doing that work, like where do you picture them being able, like how do you think it's going to help in the world that we live in where inequality is such a huge problem?
For me, I think there's a natural fit. And it really comes from the history of CFT. What CFT, compassion-focused therapy, was founded, where it kind of evolved from, was Paul Gilbert, our founder, was working with individuals with really resistant depression, really treatment-resistant depression. And they found that they also had high levels of shame-based self-criticism, that these individuals tended to beat themselves up on a very high level and experience high levels of shame around it. And so even when he was doing more classic CBT and like a restructuring of thought, the restructured thought still had that same tone of kind of blaming, shaming, contempt, leaving the individual still feeling pretty bad about themselves. We know that from the research, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, that women tend to be a lot more self-critical, self-condemning, self-judgmental. At least they report to be. That's what we've seen so far. And so as we know this, thinking about kind of that same approach of bringing this kind of compassionate correction rather than shame-based self-criticism. So it's not about necessarily letting ourselves off the hook for injustices that we see or old patterns of behavior in ourselves or old stereotypes of behavior in ourselves we want to change. But this idea of bringing that, again, kind of that motivation to that suffering and finding a voice that has that authority, that's forward-looking, that looks at the next best step in correction about returning to kind of one's values or intended direction. In that sense, I see a lot of value in self-compassionate training and women's empowerment. I think that that's been emphasized, and this idea of like, it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so how do we take responsibility effectively? How do we turn towards this with courage and conviction, right? And an understanding that whatever it is we're facing might not be their fault, but it's their responsibility. And how do we hold others to that same kind of level? And I think when it comes to the level of shame-based criticism that women have faced over the course of a lifetime, based on stereotypes, being told who they are and what they're worth, or that their voice isn't valued, right? How do we stand up to that shame-based self-criticism the same way we would in ourselves? And so I think applying that same embodiment of compassion, saying no to injustice, suffering, prejudice, sexism, whatever ism you want to throw in there, and saying that's not okay. And having that kind of strength and authority, as well as that perspective taking on what's going to be most helpful here to correct or to redirect.